That's
Next up, we have Karthik Malli speaking on Indic script policy and planning in the digital age. Right.
Hi everyone. Uh, so I will be talking about index script policy and the planning in the digital age, but I'm also starting with planning in the typewriter age because there's a lot of policy building that happened in the typewriter age that hasn't carried over to the digital age, and I think it's interesting to like present this as a contrast between the two. So a little bit about myself. I am Karthik Malli. I am an independent researcher and writer, currently a graduate student at the University of Washington. And I've worked on essays and projects involving different manifestations of writing Indian languages, medieval inscriptions, early modern literature, print culture, even contemporary signage politics. And I've written for these themes for various journals and magazines in India. I've also collaborated with Typotech, a European type foundry, on projects examining graphic preferences and typographical histories in Devanagari, Manipuri, Malayalam, and Urdu. Unlike many of you here, I have no formal background in tech or design, but my work is always engaged with linguistics, and my interest in scripts and writing is informed mainly by history. But you know, as you follow the lineage of writing, you see that it comes in contact more and more with technology. Oh, I'm not sure how to do this. Damn it. Yeah, sorry about that. Did I do something?
Did the cable get knocked, maybe?
Mm.
Yeah, the cable got knocked.
Oh,
This is why I don't like using the cable. Come on.
there we go.
All right.
Yeah. Back. Yeah. And over the course of history, Indian languages have interfaced more and more with technology, starting with print and then through typewriters and now digital typography, which is, the primary manifestation of Indian languages in text today, right? So really quick overview of standardizing tendencies in written traditions in India. And this by itself could be like many hours, but for many centuries, grammatical texts dictated guidelines for literary language usage, with the earliest formative text, of course, being Panini's Ashtadhyayi for Sanskrit. And this was codified, written around 2,000 years ago. There's also the Tolkappiyam in Old Tamil, which was, it influenced Tamil, but not so much other languages. And for many centuries, literary manuscripts and literary works adhered to the rules set out in these texts. And this, in a sense, was standardization before formal state-sanctioned linguistic guidelines. A number of subsidiary traditions inspired by these texts in languages like Kannada or Bengali or Marathi, also rose over the course of time. And, these texts they broadly shaped understanding of Indian grammar well into modern times. So early printing, I'm just checking if it's on. Yeah, early printing arrived, printing as a technology arrived in India in 1556 with the Portuguese, but it was used to print a book in Portuguese initially. And although there was engaged, engaged European work with Indian languages in the centuries following that, a lot of it was limited to missionaries and colonial authorities describing, writing about, and about these languages for a European audience, or even like Bible translations, which were again large source of printed material. Indian involvement, like native quote unquote Indian involvement with the process, only dates back to the early 1800s, with Fardunji Marzban setting up the first Indian-run commercial printing press in 1812 in Bombay with his own Gujarati font. Marzban was from the Parsi community, which is a Gujarati-speaking community. And over the next next few decades, commercial presses sprout up all across South Asia and continuing into the 1900s and beyond, of course. And many iconic fonts with middle type date back to this period. And we also have lithographic traditions that were more pronounced in some traditions, for example, Urdu, but not so much in others, right? So moving on. Here is an image from a typewriter keyboard layout from Malayalam. This dates back to, I think, the 1960s, but it's an example of standardization work done pre-digital, in pre-digital times in India. It's just a very nice example that I found during my archival work that I chose to include. We see that with the rise of nationalism in India from the early 1900s onwards, literary modernization was a key mission of this project, and the typewriter as cutting edge, as a cutting edge technological product of its time was seen as representing modernity for speakers of these languages, right? And Indian intellectuals wanted typewriters in their own languages. And we have evidence as early as the 1930s where Indian intellectuals, literary figures in different languages, basically petitioned companies, Monotype and Linotype and Remington for typewriters in their own languages, as well as other machinery that would suit the modern needs of their languages, right? So what's interesting about typewriter design is that it involved sustained cooperation between both language users and manufacturers. The archives show complex interplay of actors with British and American manufacturers on one side and state governments and literary figures in India on the other. The Indian government took up the case of Hindi, which was designated the national language upon Indian independence. It was contested later, but in the 50s, it was it was designated as India's official language, national language rather, and the various regional states of India came to represent different. The different states of India represent an overlapping of region as well as language community. So, for example, Malayalam, which I referenced earlier, is spoken in Kerala, and the Kerala state government is, in a sense, the custodian of the Malayalam language, and so on and so forth for other languages like Tamil Nadu and Tamil, and Karnataka and Kannada, Bengali and West Bengal, and also to an extent now Bangladesh. But this pattern also, this pattern was present in these debates as well. So the archives reveal, the print archives that I've worked with reveal vibrant and robust dialogue between the two sides, with literary figures devising standard keyboard sets and manufacturers working with these blueprints. And it's interesting to see that in this period, we see these companies, these manufacturers taking feedback from language users, of course, like mediated through these literary figures and state governments and officials, but from these language users nonetheless, taking direct feedback from them, using this feedback to like update, design, and refine keyboards, the fonts, the character sets, letter forms, even combining forms. And we have decades worth of archival material that basically chronicles this. And we also see that civil society, especially in journalism and in responses to journalistic coverage of these events, civil society was active in critiquing the final products of these of typewriter design when they could and in the form they could. There were instances where typewriters were seen as insufficiently faithful to the language, and they were just criticized, and people chose not to use them. And of course, it's a different matter altogether that typewriters were not household objects in the sense that they might have been elsewhere. But nonetheless, they did see wide usage, especially in government offices and departments and government-run printing presses, which were numerous at the time. Yeah. Crucially, even though the technology in question was manufactured in and supplied from the West and largely America and Britain, the locus of agency over language usage was with the speakers, right? And this is a theme that I want to return to, right? And this is an interesting, again, like from the archives. A this is a sample of the proceedings of the Lucknow Conference of 1953, where the Devanagari script was reformed, or there was a reform attempt to bring it in line with um, what the Devanagari typewriter should look like. So there was a sense that this is what's on the typewriter. This is what people should write like. So there was the typewriters came to represent the future of the language, and languages were being reshaped accordingly. Even though the Devanagari script had been used for centuries prior, it was a typewriter that sort of stimulated this impulse for reform, right? And this was in 1953, merely 6 years after Indian independence in 1947, which again shows that this was a priority for the government in a sense, right? And we have in archival materials, we have records of officials saying that this is Jackie is showing. We have records of officials saying that they scripts had to come into the future in order to be represented on typewriters, right? And um, just for context, these changes were applied and are still followed for Hindi. So it's interesting to see that a lot of these changes that are today seen as tradition can be traced back to this I guess phase of activity, intellectual activity in the 1950s and 1960s. Right. Moving on to early digital technology, Central Institute of Indian Languages (CIIL) was founded in 1969. It was initially founded as a body to guide linguistic research and standardization and pedagogy in various Indian languages, and to have it for this development to be across languages, to be in conversation across languages, right? And we see from the early from the late 1980s and the early 1990s a flurry of activity looking at emerging technology and how to use it for Indian languages. Of course, at this stage, it was largely theoretical, hypothetical, and this like in I guess higher level of abstraction. But it was interesting that this was something that was taken up by a government in a government body at that point. Um, yeah. So the first InScript keyboard, and the InScript keyboard is a keyboard layout designed for, it was designed for Indic scripts, although it follows the matrix of Devanagari, the primary script of Hindi and Marathi, more closely. It was designed in 1991, and it was later put into policy through the Bureau of Indian Standards. We see a lot of work around technology at this period that didn't make it into. I mean, we don't see like there aren't, I guess, final products of any of this, but it's interesting to see all this like work in the archives, and yeah, and also there was the sense that this is again very important. The sense that the sense of custodianship over Indian languages and their usage, that the government felt compelled to assume the role of, right. This, of course, is also in line with India's like general like socialist tendencies, where a lot of state planning, a lot of cultural planning was done by the state, but it extended to language as well, right? I am just so something that stood out to me was in 2016, the Bureau of Indian Standards released a mandate for all mobile and like laptop desktop devices sold in India to support all 22 Indian languages in the schedule of the eighth schedule all 22 languages in the eighth schedule of the Indian Constitution, right? And many of these languages have various different scripts. If you ever look at an Indian currency note, on the reverse you can see like all of these languages, and they're all in like different scripts. Most of them are in different scripts. But why was this done? Well, for one, the overwhelming majority of Indian users that were now using the internet, and this was also the time when data prices were amongst they had like plummeted in India and become, I think, the cheapest in the world almost. There was free 4G data, and like a lot of people started um, using mobile devices, but these users had never used any other digital device before. They had no access to laptops, and these phones were their first phones ever. So they were basically entering an entirely new space. And even though they were literate in their languages, in the context of their own education or like day to day written usage, they had no idea how to use these on their devices. And there were also a large number of scripts that were just not supported on these devices, even if they were included in Unicode. I always take the example of Kannada and Odia, which collectively have over 60 million speakers, right? And these languages were not, anecdotally, they were not supported on most digital devices, just because people making these phones didn't care about them. And that's just two languages with 60 million people between them, right? And neither of these languages were minor. They're both languages of large states within India, right? They're not minority languages in any sense. But once this mandate was released in 2016, we see that a lot of almost over the course of a year, phones went from choosing to support major Indian languages to doing it by default because it was mandated, right? And a lot of these phones were manufactured in China. So we see, during that period, a lot of these companies started purchasing fonts from Indian, designers and and making sure that their phones supported these languages. Um, it's an interesting moment in, I would say, in Indian language history, because it's this case study of how the locus of language agency was shifted, if briefly, back to the users of these languages, right? Um, we also see, so this is also following like many years of sorry many years of a lot of this work, with language technology and scripts and stuff being done almost unilaterally from like by companies, tech companies, where they would claim that they've added font support for their, for so and so language, but the language would not render properly, or or they wouldn't include all languages, or just the quality of fonts were poor, or just they didn't care enough to even do that. So we see this. It's kind of a sad phase, in a sense, but it's also interesting to see how the locus of linguistic agency in the digital period was shifting away from the users, and this was briefly, I guess, addressed by the BIS standard mandate. But this has been a recurring theme in language technology. Sorry, this has been a recurring theme in Indian language technology, where a company like unilaterally develops something and like puts it out, and then users get back with feedback saying, "Hey, we don't have our language, or this isn't rendering properly on." For our language on so and so device, and then the company chooses to go back and fix it, or not. And um, yeah, it's the sort of government intervention that we saw in the typewriter era has, I guess, it's been rendered ineffective because of, on one hand, the government's own unfamiliarity with technology, and two, like the, I guess, just the amount of control that you know companies can have over their finished products, right? And at the same time, we also see issues with you know, as a former British colony, English is one of India's official languages, and around 10% of, only 10% of India's now 1.4 billion people speak English. And you know that leaves like 90%, which Google in its advertising speak has termed the next billion. But there is some truth to that, where you know there are at least like, I mean, there are hundreds of millions of Indian language speakers who are inconvenienced by the existing, I guess, the existing language technology out there, and also the the quality of it, and and what there, like there have been many studies about how users like work around these things by either just using Latin script, you know, typing to like render their scripts in, I mean, to type in their languages but through the Latin script, or they send voice notes, or you know they just like write in broken English. But users have been proactive in working around these constraints, but they shouldn't have to. And it's also um, yeah, there's sort of a gap between the two, right? Which policy can address and has attempted to address and has successfully addressed, I guess, in the past with typewriters, but we don't see this level of engagement today with digital policy, right? Um, Another interesting use case was the Amazon Kindle, which supports a number of Indian languages, including Hindi, Bengali, and Tamil. But strikingly, it doesn't have Kannada, which is again spoken by over 50 million people, and is also the state language of one of Amazon's largest offices in India, which is kind of ironic. But I guess, but once again, there have been online campaigns from Kannada speaking users for Amazon to like support it, but then there seems to be some mismatch or some, you know, just some gap between the two. And once again, it seems like it only happens if tech company in question actively goes out of their way to like do it, right? And notably, it wasn't covered in the 2016 mandating for language support either, right? Yeah. So even within language discourse and policy in India, and you know, in these other players, we see some tensions. For example, the state custodianship of languages can and has been contested by you know, by native speakers, most notably in the case of Tulu, where Tulu was it's a minority language spoken in Karnataka by around 1.5 million people, but the script, which was revived after many centuries, was was intended to be added to Unicode, and then the government of Karnataka instituted a committee to submit a proposal, you know, to Unicode, which was then contested by another set of native speakers, and this battle like raged on for like over a decade, and Tulu was only added to Unicode, I think last month, after after a long time. And in the meanwhile, Tulu speakers resorted to all sorts of workarounds, including using the graphically similar but linguistically, graphically similar Malayalam script to represent their language. It's like the equivalent of using Greek to represent Cyrillic. You know, it's a weird workaround, but people had to make do with it, right? And in-script keyboards that we spoke of earlier have not proven to be popular because with the advent of mobile devices and like, you know, I guess mobile first approach to language input, people have just sort of leapfrogged over that, and now they're either using transliteration largely, and there have been multiple studies where users in Indian languages just, they just say that they prefer transliteration because the keyboards that are offered to them are maybe unwieldy or um, they need work, or they're just like not comfortable with them, right? They're not trained to use them either. That's another thing. Yeah. And this is another complication is the fact that Indian language users largely have low purchasing power within India, where they're seen as, the primary users of tech are seen as English speaking users, and the next billion, to borrow Google's phrase, that set of users is seen as an afterthought, where language support is good, but it's not necessary and it doesn't have to work necessarily. It just needs to be there, right? So we again see this attitude where tech support is, like the bare minimum, and it's often things end there, but UI, the like existing UI UX of these devices does not necessarily push users towards using their languages on these devices, right? We also see the homogenizing, like work of these Indian like central government institutions that are largely Devanagari centric, and there have been criticisms of that where users of other languages have just like come up with their own keyboards, especially for languages that are linguistically and graphically different, like Malayalam and Meitei, right? Um, a quote that was interesting to me from one of these studies is, "It should be clear that the frequency of any one character in any given language would not match the usage frequency of the same character in another language." Pretty basic, right? But even this seems to have been ignored in existing government-driven keyboard design, right? And yeah, I think we're seeing slowly, like with the case of the 2016 mandate, which was, companies were given 2 years to comply, and by 2018 they started complying. We see the results of this in like phone usage as well, where once language support has been instituted and like rolled out, you know. Other companies follow, like local, like Indian companies as well. They start releasing apps in these languages. They start like localizing their own apps, and their services. And we see that this, in general, the locus of linguistic agency has shifted, but um, it it seems like policy is a good way to combat and contest this. And it's still like early for the Indian government and these other state governments to, I guess, institute like more concrete, more comprehensive policies. But um, it it is happening in these silos across the country, but slowly, right? For example, recently the government of Kerala uh, mandated like certain font standards for its documents. These again were contested by people in civil society, including font designers working with Malayalam, but the government went ahead with it despite consultation from these users. So we see there are these multiple levels of tensions as well, and and gaps in policy planning. And it seems, I guess, also instructive to look back at how some of this worked in the typewriter era, right? Which is why I brought that up. And I'm keeping this short, so I want to end this here. Um, but I'm interested if there are any questions. And I'm gonna go with you
Yeah,
first.
so, um, just so that I've got the right mental image of when you talk about support for these languages and these
Right.
scripts, are you purely speaking of being able to display the characters and provide keyboard input of them? Or are you speaking of actually like localized operating systems or even localized application UI?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I should have clarified. I was referring to the former, where and you're right. Like a lot of this support is it's given, but then kind of ends there, and it's sometimes like you have font support, but then the fonts don't render properly, and it's like especially with Indic scripts that are like super complex, it becomes unreadable if nothing, like even if you have support and if it doesn't render properly, it's just legible. Doesn't matter if there is support. And then of course, like other things like a lot of UX side issues where, like, for example, like ads that are so I've worked at some of these companies where like ads are just written in English and then you have a team translating them into Indian languages, and these are Indian companies, right? So then you have basically an ad that's designed for English, and then it's just like every other language is like shoehorned into that. Yeah.
So sorry, just same question, but a
Yeah.
little different wording. So you're saying that these mandates for support, they demand being able to put the characters up on the screen in a way to input the characters so that you can create data associated with those glyphs. But they didn't mandate that the operating system show its menuing structure and the settings in those languages, or didn't mandate that content
right.
be in those languages, or didn't mandate that apps show the user interface written in that language. They just demand showing characters.
Yeah, that's kind of, yeah, that's basically it. But we also, I mean, that's basically it. And I don't think it should just be like mandated by the government, but even this basic level of just like supporting these fonts was, I guess it was like a major milestone, so to speak. And perhaps more could be mandated in the future. I just want to go to this question.
Thanks a lot for your talk. It's fascinating. How much interest is there in the Indian market for localized applications? I mean, is that interest like active use or need, or is it symbolic, or?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and honestly, that could be maybe a session by itself. But it's actually a great question because, in my experience, and this is anecdotal, but in my experience, sometimes the largest like opponents of Indian language support or Indian language usage are like other Indians, because they're like, you know what, if they're not using English, we shouldn't be marketing to them, because again, there's this widespread belief and that any, I mean, there is a correlation, but that your primary market, so to speak, they're like Indians who know English, right? People who've been like white collar employees and stuff. But there has been pushback against that, and there are symbolic usage. Like there is like, for example, like minority languages that aren't widely used for, let's say, like technology or even like applications. People would still want like symbolic, the ability, like Tulu, like the the language that I mentioned that was just added to Unicode after like a decade-long sort of struggle. That language is not used for like formal sort of communication, but its speakers are very like keen on using it for symbolic purposes, like even signage, right? It could just be as simple as signage. And I feel like a lot of this has to happen despite these opposing forces within the community, and also to recognize that there are these opposing forces, if that answers your question.
I was also wondering about, is there interest within users for app localization, for example, or website localization, in addition to display and because there's like, do you want to produce documents in Photoshop in Telugu versus do you want Photoshop localized?
Yeah, I think so far we haven't heard enough from like users that primarily only speak these languages, because again, they tend to be or rather languages who don't, users who don't speak English, because these users also tend to be new to tech in general. So they don't even know, like in a sense, it's like they don't know what is not available to them. It's sort of like a catch-22 of sorts. Like text.
Yeah, so
Making everyone shout.
So kind of pursuing the same sort of ideas, but I was wondering if you've categorized the users and the applications that they want to use, because to treat 50 million kind of the users as a block and saying, well, they prefer English, probably doesn't get into the groups, as you mentioned, the ones that may speak Kannada, but aren't interested in English, and maybe there are groups that would like to connect with their community and just do messaging without having the full range of applications. So the data, in really to understand, as you mentioned, listening to users, you have to have different categories of users and usages
Absolutely.
in order to understand the market. And I haven't heard that in the talk. So is
Yeah.
that, and you can't rely on just a digital approach to asking questions
sure,
of the community, as you were just referring to. You have to actually go into the community
sure.
and survey them.
Just to clarify that the point about them preferring English was not didn't come from me. It's like what people in the a lot of people who design these apps believe. They're like, we're giving you English, use it, because if you're using a phone, you probably know English anyway.
It's convenient for us to assign that assumption.
Absolutely, yeah. And you're right that so I think there has to be more like user research done, and I think that is the largest sort of gap in the data that we have. And just we don't know enough about what users want. And also it's difficult because, as I just mentioned, like a lot of these users just have never used any digital devices, or they're just using the phone for like messaging or calling people. So if like WhatsApp, which is super popular in India, everyone has it, if that supports their language, for many people that's all they need. But there have been cases where a certain app has actually gained more market share because it supported certain languages. If I'm not wrong, I think TikTok did something similar before it was banned by the Indian government, but I think they did something similar where it was available. And also, I mean, it's TikTok, it's video, so you're going to be like listening to what people, but its mass popularity can be attributed to the fact that kind of, I guess, worked around, the lack of, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious to what extent the data is impacted by the fact that, well, one, it sounds like you just need to collect more data, but to what extent is it impacted by the fact that you don't know what users don't exist? Like if there are people who do not use technology, but would if it was in their language,
Yeah.
well, how do you know? Because they don't use it. How are you going to ask them? You just have to go out and find them.
I mean, no, that's a good question. I wish I knew the answer to that.
Thanks, Karthik. I had a quick question about just the political context behind the 2016 mandate. I think it's so interesting that there was a mandate for all 22 scheduled languages. So,
Absolutely.
what was going on that led to that? And could you speak to what the context is today? I heard some rumblings that some people are calling for ISKI to come back and another kind of boycott of Unicode.
Yeah.
And there's a contingent that interested. So.
Yeah, it's a good question. And honestly, I think, again, like, this is complicated by the fact that a lot of the nitty gritty, like, it's not of interest to most users. So, but then there have been instances where, like, there's been criticism of, like, let's say, display in a certain, like, let's say, Hindi display, Hindi tends to be well resourced, but, like, let's say, like, Kannada display where they're like, it's not rendering well enough, and then they start saying things like we can make our own, can make something better. But I think that's more of a reaction to just the poor quality of what they have presented to them, like, and it's also an interesting question about the political context of the 2016 mandate. I think there was some anxiety over phones being manufactured in China, but I'm not too familiar with, like, I'll try to find out. I'll definitely try to find out. Yeah.
I'm just curious with regard to the 2016 mandate. When you say mandate, clearly some group had a will to bring about some change.
Right.
What teeth did they have to bring about the change? What was the enforcement that was being put in place?
So this was a Bureau of Indian Standards, which is a government body, and it directly works with the Ministry of it's called MeitY in India. I'm actually not sure what it's like. Information and, like, Communication Department of the government. So it had basically central government, federal government backing. So once they mandated it, like, any company that was, since it was through the IT department, any company that operated in India had to follow the mandate.
So it was a license to sell products or services in India, as opposed to a procurement requirement if you want to sell your product to the Ministry of IT, we are going to have this as a requirement.
I'm not entirely sure about the like that side of things, but I do know that it says that any digital device that's sold in India must carry typing support and language support for these languages. And since it was linked to the Ministry of IT and Communication, it had to be followed by anyone doing business in India.
Okay, I'm curious about this because I remember roughly in that time frame hearing about some new Indian standards and requirements, and never saw clearly indication of how it was being enforced. And this is interesting because from a global software vendor perspective, if you compare, if you look at countries that have any kinds of enforcement around language technology,
Right.
there aren't that many cases, right? If you compare this to something like privacy, where there's an increasing number, right? And today AI, countries all over the place are, jumping on the bandwagon of we need some kind of
AI
regulatory policy.
Yeah.
China is the clearest case. If you want to sell your products, if you want license to sell your products in China, you have to go through a certification testing, right, to verify. And if you want to sell your products to, so there's a legal requirement for sale, and there is a stronger requirement if you want to sell to government ministries, public sector. And I didn't, after China, the closest case of a sort of broad language technology thing that I had seen was this thing in India, but I never saw a clear indication that it was really being strongly enforced. But I may have just not be familiar with what was going on.
It would be interesting to compare the two, and you're right that I haven't seen, or it's not like common to hear about like language support being mandated by like at the government level. I also think it's because, of course, like there's so many languages and like support for them has been poor and spotty, and like it's just been up to the manufacturer for the most part. I think the government, there was some political will like within the government to like say like, hey, this needs to be done. But it'd be great to like explore that further, like the history behind the mandate. Yeah. I think we're at time.
One question, which was, this might be a little bit open-ended, but from the Unicode standpoint, we get, you talked about a bunch of the tensions where like the government is kind of like stomping on individuals. And I feel like we see a lot of cases of that where one group is claiming to speak for another group. And it's not always just government versus people. It can be people versus people. Absolutely. It can be this group of people versus that group of people versus the government of another country. And it gets really complicated, and people get really, people have strong opinions. Do you have any observations about this kind of dynamic from the research you've done, or any advice on how to be better at handling this?
Yeah, I will. My quick answer is no, but I would also, but I think it's worth like looking into, because also like sometimes, like you said, like sometimes it's like people against people, and then it's like who's like, do you take more like technocratic approach where you say like, you know what, like this is what the archives show, or like this is what, and again, this happened with Tulu where like one party was like, this is what people want to use, or this is what we've sort of been teaching people, right? The government's point of view, that was. But then on the other side, the civil, I guess, the archivist's view was that this is what's in the inscriptions. And what's in the inscriptions is not necessarily what people want to use. And that was, I think, the major point of tension between the two. And one camp was like, you know what, it has to be as faithful to the inscriptions as possible. And the other camp was like, you know what, this is what's in the education system. But again, I don't have an answer to it as such, but I think it's interesting because the dynamics of who, like, then you'd have to look at the dynamics, or the power dynamic between the people, the groups that are presenting this as well. And there's, again, like, even if it's someone from civil society, they're not obviously speaking for the entirety of civil society. You know, it tends to be scholars, it tends to be historians.
You mentioned Meitei, and that's got a similar dynamic.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I really like yarn. I really like yarn.
Or nor. I got some on Etsy. Remember animations and deep links.
That's for me or for you?
Well, one is for you. One is for me.
I think deep press is not too bad for me to have either.
Huh?
That's a rural I know you guys don't.
Right up front.
All right.
And I'm gonna ask all the hard finite algorithm questions.
Oh, it's a little more surface level than you. Of course you will. Oh, I think we can just poke at it, but I plugged it in. It didn't do the thing. Let's see here.
So here, this is the tap.
Okay.
Now it did do it.
Hey, look at that.
Not to run towards the bear.
That sounds good. And then can
First, you're
I?
not supposed to say the true name of the bear. You won't have this problem in the first place. But
Okay. And then we can do. Okay, cool. Yeah. So you should be good. And then
if it ever,
when it comes to switch over to mobile web app or back, I can do it.
You'll switch it back and forth.
if the cable jiggles out of place, the thing to do to make it work again is to go to
Touch cable. Got it.
It'll be
And we're mic'd right here, right?
your mic.
Test.
Yes.
Hello.
Wait, actually, we should also